About a decade ago, my college buddies and I decided to reunite for a weekend camping trip, 4 people in total. We had all kind of gotten lost in the craziness of adult life, and as such, we hadn't had time to really see each other or get together. And what better way to catch up after a few years than to spend some time in the wilderness, right? We live near some pretty decent lakes and determined that spending some time out there was the best idea. A couple of nights spent around a campfire, under the stars in the middle of pretty much nowhere, was going to be a good time. We arrived on the planned Friday afternoon. It was a decently warm day, and we found our spot where we were going to set up, just off the main trail in a clearing in the open forest. A perfect spot for us to set up our tents. We did so, and after a few hours decided to get the fire going, even though it was still fairly warm out. The sun was mostly set, and the sky was that nice orange pink that it gets when the night comes. Then we were just sitting there reminiscing about the good old days. As the night progressed, we were all sitting around and starting to grow tired. When one of the guys, Kevin, jumped up a bit and asked, "Hey, do you guys hear that?" I turned to him and asked what he meant. He then said that there was a sound in the woods. I listened for a moment but didn't hear anything out of the ordinary, just the sounds of the night in the woods, crickets, owls, nothing too crazy. I mentioned that he may have just heard a deer or something, but I could tell by his face that he didn't think it was a deer. We got back to the conversation, but I could tell that Kevin was a bit on edge. After about 5 or so more minutes, I heard the sound. And I turned to Kevin and saw him with the same look on his face from earlier, which told me that I had heard what he heard. I turned around to see if I could see anything, and much to my surprise, I did. I saw some movements off to the side. Someone was walking toward us. I mentioned that there was someone walking our way to the group, and everyone else turned toward where I was looking, all of us squinting to see who was approaching from the darkness of the woods. One of the guys even asked, "Who's there?" A man stepped into the light where we could finally see him, and he looked like a fairly normal guy. He was wearing jeans and a hoodie, and he looked clean-shaven, like he was just an everyday dude. My initial thought was that he was another camper who maybe had heard us talking and was coming over to visit or something. He didn't seem threatening at first, just a bit out of place. Marcus stood up and asked, "Hey, man, can we help you?" And he sounded friendly but cautious, which told me that he was thinking the same thing I was. At first, the guy didn't respond. He just looked at all of us for a moment, kind of taking all of us in individually. Then he said, "Hey, I'm just passing through, mind if I warm up by the fire for a moment?" Something about him put me on edge, but Marcus responded quickly with a, "Yeah, man, that's fine." The guy smirked and sat down by the fire, kind of away from the rest of us, and he just stared at the flames. Like, intensely stared. The 4 of us tried to keep the conversation going, but it felt kind of awkward, like we were all talking over an uninvited guest. After a couple of minutes of just staring at the fire, the man stood up and said, "Thanks for letting me sit here. You folks have a good night." Without even a glance, he just started walking back the way he'd come. As he walked off, Kev kind of chuckled and said, "Well, that was weird, huh?" We all sort of laughed and agreed, but thought it was just a thing that maybe happened and that we were going to move on. Just as we were starting to ease back into our relaxation, the sounds from earlier came back, but this time, they were louder and more prominent. We all turned in the direction we thought it was coming from and were all taken aback when we saw 3 guys all walking our way, all wearing masks, and all of them armed. One of them spoke up as they approached, "All right, everyone, nice and easy. We don't want trouble. Just give us your valuables, and no one has to get hurt." We all stood up and kind of huddled together. Normally, the 4 of us weren't cowardly, but these guys all had guns, and they clearly meant business. Marcus tried to tell them that we didn't have much on us, that we were just camping for a couple of days, but one of the guys raised his weapon and said, "I didn't ask what you had. I told you to give us all of your belongings. Now, empty your pockets and your bags." We all did as we were told, our hands shaking at the thought that we might not make it out of this alive, plaguing us. They took our wallets, our cell phones, and literally everything else they could find. They even grabbed the cooler and took all of our food. After a few moments of them rifling through what we had, one of them nodded at the others and said something about that being good enough. The third guy then said something that made me nearly piss myself. Should we go ahead and just put them down? When he said this, I couldn't help but go into pleading mode. Whoa, guys, come on. Now you got our stuff. We're in the middle of nowhere. We all have families that will miss us. Can we just call it good? You got what you wanted, right? No need to turn this into a full-blown homicide. I wasn't really sure what I was saying. I was just talking and trying to get them to move on without pulling the trigger. They all paused and turned to look at each other for a few moments, then back at us. The one that asked if they should put us down kind of shrugged at the other two, and then one of them said, "All right, fine. But you all need to leave. If I ever see you around here again, you won't be so lucky." With that, they all started walking away with our stuff. And after a few seconds, they had melted into the night and were completely gone, leaving us shaken, but mostly unharmed. We sat there for a moment in silence, the four of us just thinking about what to do when Kev finally said, "We should probably go." We all agreed. We put out the fire and packed up our tents, literally the only things we had left, and made our way back to where the car was parked. Thankfully, Marcus had the car's key in his pocket, and since it was an older car, it was just a plain metal key with no fob, and it was small enough that they didn't notice he had it on him, because they likely would have taken that too. When we got to the car, Marcus asked where we should go. I mentioned that a police station was probably the best bet, or at least somewhere close by with a phone so we could call 911 to report the incident. To this day, we still talk about that night whenever we get together. We've all pretty much refused to go camping since it happened. Even though it's been over a decade at this point, none of our stuff was ever recovered, and I don't think the guys were ever found. I don't know if they were willing to go through with the plan of actually killing us or if that was just a scare tactic, but if so, it definitely worked. We were scared. The whole thing felt like a wrong place, wrong time kind of situation, and my guess is that the first guy was the scout for the other three. Or I guess he could have been one of them and he was trying to see if we were worth the time. In the end, I'm just glad that we all made it out alive, terrified, but alive nonetheless. In late autumn, my friends and I decided to have one last bonfire before the winter chill set in, a final chance to get out and be stupid at night before it got too cold or started snowing. None of us are fans of winter, we're definitely a summer flock, so we wanted to squeeze one more good night out of the season. We had a usual spot where we would get together, part of the property owned by Sarah's grandparents, out behind their little cabin-like thing that they have going on. It's secluded and quiet. There aren't any city lights or people to deal with, just the four of us, the fire, and the wilderness. That night started off great. We set up our tents, got a decent pile of wood and sticks to burn, and got the fire going as the sun was starting to set. My boyfriend Kenneth did most of the work for setting up the fire, as he was the most well-versed in survival tactics. Sarah's boyfriend, Les, was more interested in getting drunk, while Sarah and I helped where we could. Once the fire was ready to go, we sat around just talking about whatever and roasting marshmallows, as cliché demands. After a while, Les drunkenly said that he wanted to tell a scary story, so we shifted to that. Les went first, then I told some dumb urban legend story that I remembered, and then Sarah started telling us about a time when she swore she saw a figure at the foot of her bed as a kid. It was pretty creepy, even creepier when she mentioned that she didn't make it up, that one night she'd had this really weird sleep paralysis and swore that there was basically a shadow demon at the foot of her bed, smiling at her and just watching her sleep. It was a good spooky time, but we were all laughing and just having a good time. About an hour or so later, we were all ready to head to sleep. Kenneth and I started to get our stuff gathered, and when he went to put out the fire, Les asked what he was doing. Kenneth told him that we needed to put it out before we went to sleep, but Les told him to leave it for a while, that he didn't want to go to bed quite yet, so he would put it out when he was tired. Kenneth told him that that didn't sound like a good idea and that he seemed a bit too drunk and should go to bed. But Les was adamant that he would be fine. He stood up and started hopping on one foot, saying, "See, like that was something that only could be done by someone sober," and then laughed, saying that we could all go to sleep but he wasn't tired. Sarah said that she wanted to go to sleep, and Les just waved her off, saying, "I'll join you in a bit. I just want to enjoy the fire a little more." I could tell that he was starting to go from adamant to drunkenly annoyed, so I just told Kenneth that he'd be alright, mentioned the bucket of water to put it out to Les, and said that we should all get to sleep. They both hesitantly agreed, and we went into our respective tents, myself and Kenneth in one, and Sarah and Les in the other. I swear no sooner had I fallen asleep did we hear a bone-chilling scream coming from outside, followed by a huge string of swearing and "help me." At first, I thought I was just dreaming, but Kenneth jumped up too. We both quickly shot out of the tent to see Les half in and half out of the fire pit, struggling to get up. His clothes were burning, he was singed, and his face had a look of pure agony. Kenneth yelled out and raced over to try and help him out of the fire. I grabbed the bucket of water to pour on him to put out his clothes, and Sarah was just standing there, asking what the hell had happened. Les was really badly burned all over his right arm and leg, and he was just moaning in pain. After a few moments, he was able to finally tell us what happened. Apparently, he had needed to empty his bladder and thought it would be funny to pee on the fire. He had stood up and fully managed to trip over the stump that we used as a chair and landed straight into the fire pit. Since he was way too inebriated, he flailed and struggled to get out of the fire, not able to focus on his movements with the pain that was surging through his body at that time. That's when he screamed. He'd been in the fire, a well-built fire that was still pretty large, for several moments before it occurred to him that he could scream for help. Kenneth said that we needed to get him to the hospital immediately, as the burns on his leg were severe. Sarah grabbed a blanket and wrapped him up, careful to avoid his arm. I put out the fire with the remaining water. Thankfully, this was property that belonged to Sarah's grandparents, so we could leave the tents and not have to spend time packing up. We all got in the Jeep, Les and Sarah sitting in the back, and me and Kenneth in the front. Every bump and jolt caused Les to groan in agony, and Kenneth tried to slow down over every obvious rough patch, but it really didn't matter. When we finally arrived at the emergency room, the staff rushed Les inside, and we all sat in the waiting room, hoping that he wouldn't be too badly messed up. A couple of hours later, one of the doctors came out to talk to us about Les. He had mostly second-degree burns, but at least partial third-degree burns on his leg. The fact that he was drunk may have actually helped him not be in severe agony, and he was lucky that he didn't spend any more time struggling in the fire, because it could have been much, much worse. They got him patched up and led us back to see him. Much to our surprise, when we walked in, he actually laughed and said, "Heh, guys, am I the biggest dumbass or what?" We spent the rest of the weekend visiting Les to make sure he was recovering. They kept him overnight to make sure that his severe burns, which were only about 5% of the entire area, didn't get infected and were attended to properly. The next morning, when he finally sobered up, Les mentioned that he was definitely in a lot of pain, but that he was probably going to be okay. He was apologetic for ruining our little camping trip, but we were just glad that he was fine. Surprisingly, that was the last time I ever saw Les drunk, and he definitely became more controlled with his drinking. He has some pretty bad scars on him now from it, but I think he took it as a lesson. Don't get drunk and play with fire, no matter how funny you think it'll be.